Hi, everybody. So this is really exciting. We are here to have our latest episode of Chicks on Flicks. We are here to talk about Bridge Over the River Kwai. This is a classic film from director David Lean and from 1952 and or 1957, excuse me. And Christine is here to talk about this film. And do you want to say hi?
Yeah, hi everybody.
Yeah, and sorry that we're a little irregular. You know, it's just the throes of doing this as our hobby. We just do it the best we can. So thanks for being patient with us, and we're excited to talk about this film. This was one on Roger Ebert's list of his films that would restore your faith in humanity. And so it's going to be interesting to talk about his review and also sort of our thoughts about the movie. And, he liked the fact that this movie turned, I guess, war, instead of a typical war movie being about the war and about the battles, that this was a character piece and really focused on these individuals and their journeys through this experience that they had. And so I could totally see his perspective in that regard. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to talk about. So what were some of your just overall basic thoughts about Bridge of the River Kwai?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I didn't like this movie. I was just telling Rachel that I hadn't seen it previous to this. I had very little idea of what it was even about.
Okay.
Before seeing it, and just I just felt like this movie was distractingly racist, like overwhelmingly racist, and to the point where I had a hard time caring about the story or characters or anything they were presenting because of the way that it was all packaged. So,
okay.
Yeah. Well, so I had trouble with this movie.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. So I actually really enjoy this film. I think that you have this standoff between these two generals. I think the sort of the changes that Colonel Nicholson makes are really interesting. The way that he goes from being this to being the standoff guy that he's not going to give in at all for his officers working, to by the end, because he has sort of, I guess, drank the Kool-Aid, for lack of a better expression. He's not only having his officers work on this, but he is going into the hospital and recruiting people, and yet he realizes, I love I think it's Colonel Clifton. He's so great. He's kind of sort of the moral voice in this, that he realizes that things have gotten completely that things have gotten out of hand, and he even has the last lines of the movie, madness, and sort of the madness of war, and he realizes that he realizes before Nicholson that this is helping the enemy, for them, that this is not a good thing, but it's just the weirdness of war and the weirdness of things. And so anyway, I really like that whole dynamic of kind of what happens with these characters. And I think there are weaknesses to the film, but overall I just find it very engrossing, and I like it. So there you go.
Cool.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the positives that we have in it, and then we'll both talk about some of those negatives. So basically, the story of the movie is this camp, this prisoner of war camp in Burma, that they have to that Commander Colonel Saito of the Japanese army has been commanded that they have to build a bridge. And there is this whole battalion of British soldiers that has surrendered, and That is led by Colonel Nicholson, and he refuses initially to build the bridge, and he brings out the Geneva Convention and says, and to somebody like Colonel Saito, like, that's just ridiculous, like, this is war. And anyway, and so they have this standoff at first, and there's also this lieutenant, this American that is there then named Captain Shear or Commander Shears, and played by William Holden. And he is kind of cynical, and he sees like kind of the ridiculousness of all parts of this, both sides. Anyway, and so they are able to get kind of finally after Nicholson wins the battle of the officers training, are working on the bridge. He actually, once he's able to kind of be sort of tricked into believing it's sort of his idea, and that he sort of, or not tricked, but once he ends up kind of feeling like it's his idea, then he becomes actually really excited about it, and that this is going to be like a gift for England, to the world, and anyway, so things just get kind of out of control, and then Commander Shears is able to escape, and he ends up going back and eventually ends up destroying the bridge. But that's kind of the story. But what I like about it, like I said, I think that it has really, first of all, it's super well made, really great acting, really great cinematography, and all the other production values. But I think that it comes down to, I just think it has really interesting characters. I think that Colonel Saito is very interesting because he's somebody who has experienced the West. He's an educated person. He knows, he loves corned beef. He loves, he wants to be in a way like Nicholson, I think. And then Nicholson is this interesting character because he's been a soldier his entire life. He's always been in the army, and that's all he's sort of known. And so when he gets involved in this sort of project, he feels like, well, maybe I'm doing something that actually matters. So to me, that was interesting. I think, anyway, I won't go into weaknesses, but that's what I liked, is particularly the battle between these two men. And I think that they are both really well acted by Susu Hayakawa and Alec Guinness. So those are some. Did you have any strengths that you felt about the film?
I'll borrow what my husband liked.
Okay.
Because I thought that was interesting. I didn't. Maybe the cinematography was fine. There was no point where I was like, wow, that's great cinematography. But I might give it that. My husband thought that this was just a really interesting movie from the standpoint of leadership. He was an officer. My husband was an officer in the Navy, so he was able to experience, military leadership firsthand, working with people both above him and, under him. And so he thought it was just really kind of an amazing take on like what can happen as a leader, and how you can garner so much respect and admiration from your men that they'll follow you to the depths of hell or build a bridge for the enemy, So he thought that was really interesting. But yeah, I can't think of something about this movie that I enjoyed.
No. Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, I think that the weakness of the film is probably, even though I think William Holden is a good actor, I think that his storyline isn't as compelling to me as the standoff between the two leaders, in my opinion. When it keeps going back to him and hanging out with the nurses, and then just his whole storyline, I don't think is as good, and I think they spend too much time on it. So that to me is sort of the weakness of the movie. But I do also, I think that the film builds tension really well, but I do think it's probably a little overlong. I think you could have edited it a little bit more tightly. I think that particularly the standoff with at the beginning, the standoff over the officers, I think that drags on a little bit too long. So those would be some of my downsides. And but I think that particularly the once they get started really building the bridge, I think it's really, really great. I love it. So all right, let's hear it. Why did you think this was so racist?
Oh my gosh. I started taking notes at one point. They're just so many things. Where to begin? I think the most obvious place to begin is the sense of Western imperialism that just permeates the entire story. Comments like, thanks to the Japanese, we have a rabble on our hands. Let's teach the Japanese something about methods of Western efficiency. It was just this constant, like, let's show them what the British can do. Like, the Japanese are so bad at everything. Like, they don't know how to build a bridge. And then when it's like, well, what's wrong with the bridge? It's like, oh, they're building it in the widest part of the river, and they're building it in the softest mud. Like, we're going to be drilling, we're going to be digging till doomsday before this will work. And it's just like, it just has these Japanese people as like completely incapable, unmotivated. Like, Saito doesn't even want to be there. He's like, I wanted to be a painter, but I wasn't even a very good painter. And he's just pathetic. He cries when he loses control. After that, he just sits and watches him, he just watches Nicholson do everything. It's just, the Brits, oh my gosh. It was just, oh my gosh. And if they said jolly good show one more time, and then it was just tea, it was just stereotypes everywhere. And I just felt like in the end, it didn't feel to me like an anti-war movie. And that I recognize is an opinion. This is the kind of movie where it's good because of what you get out of it, So it's like, if someone watches this movie and they feel like the madness of war is reinforced in their mind, then it's a good movie for them, like subjectively. But, yeah.
I push back with you a little bit on that. I don't necessarily think that it not being an anti-war movie is a bad thing. I think it's sharing this experience and having you sort of decide whether it's anti-war is a good thing. I think it actually is somewhat complex because there is a side of you that says that kind of can kind of at the beginning at least sort of you want to sort of agree with what Nicholson is doing, and that this is like so constructive and everything, but then you realize like this is going to be aiding a train that's going to be taking hurting the Allies, and hurting and so I actually like that it's sort of complex and that it's not an anti-war movie.
Oh, well, so I didn't see it as an anti-war movie. The reason I made that comment was because it was marketed that way. And a lot of, like, when I looked up reviews and was reading about it, people were like, this is one of the greatest anti-war movies of all time. And I was like, so
yeah,
if you don't see it that way,
I don't agree with that. I think it does have a theme of the madness of war, but I don't think that necessarily means anti-war. I think that it's just about these characters who are caught in a war. But I've certainly seen, I guess, a lot more heavy-handed anti-war movies that were a lot more emotionally manipulative. And I don't think that this was that, I guess. So I wouldn't describe it in that way, but it's interesting if other people, I think it's a movie that you can really interpret a lot of different ways.
You can interpret it a lot of different ways.
Which I think is a strength of the film, that it's not one that's preaching to you, in my opinion, about this is the way to look about these characters. It's interesting that you felt that Saito was pathetic. I actually found him to be a really human character because he is somebody that has experienced lots of different things, and so he's not just sort of the evil bad guy kind of thing. Like he knows what will happen to him if he fails at this. Something that what does being in a general have anything to do with building a bridge? You know what I mean? Like, that's not a skill set of a soldier. And so I think that he's completely in over his head. And I didn't take it as like all Japanese people, nobody can build a bridge. I just took it as these people don't have the skills, and I don't know. I thought he was a really great character. I thought that was really moving when he cried. He's somebody who's just kind of hanging on for dear life. And, he's trying to, and he admires Nicholson, I think. And he's envious of him in a way. And I think in some ways, Nicholson is envious of Saito in certain ways. And so, yeah, I didn't have that issue. I can see your point of view, but I really like the performance, and that's what was the strength to me about this movie was these two men kind of batting heads together, and I just think the transformation behind Nicholson of going from this person who is completely against it, is not going to want anything to do with it, and once he sort of wins, he has a victory in a way, then all of a sudden, like, it's almost like that gives him a chance to sort of breathe and be like, all of a sudden he's sort of more open to those things, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I agree that Saito is envious of him and admires him, but I just saw that as a reinforcement of the superiority of Western civilization and engineering, that Nicholson has put. Like, he's just so great, and Saito is just so frustrated because he's just not as good, like, at anything. So I would agree with the interpretation of what the characters are doing, but then I guess we take it in completely different directions of how we feel about that presentation.
Yeah, which is completely fair. I guess I didn't take a sort of broader. I just looked at it as just these two characters, not as like a representations of their race.
Right.
So, and that's totally fair. But just different ways of looking at it. Did you like any of the acting? Did you think they were good at all?
I think Alec Guinness is always good. So I think maybe I was taking him for granted, that he was going to be good in this movie. But I just got so caught up in the things I didn't like. And even it's even outside of Saito. It's even like the Japanese engineers that are incapable. Part of my experience watching the movie too is like, I compared this movie to a lot of others. Like, I compared it to Lawrence of Arabia. I compared it to
also directed by David Lean,
right? Also with Alec Guinness in it, and I compared it to South Pacific, which came out a year later. It has a lot of similar themes and a lot of similar problems. And I was thinking about Lawrence of Arabia and how my experience with that was so different. I loved it, and part of that is fact is stranger than fiction. It really, really is. There are things that you can get away with when you're telling a true story that you can't get away with when you're making up a story. So for instance, in Lawrence of Arabia, when, Lawrence is like wearing his flowing white robes and he's like on the train and all that, like, there are so many theatrical things he does that when I was watching that movie, I would look it up and be like, there's no way this was real, and if it's not real, if someone's just making it up, then it's absolutely the white savior trope. But then you look it up and you're like, oh no, this was real. So therefore I give it a pass because it's just the way it was. And so with this movie, I started doing that. And I was like, was there really this battalion that undermined their captors by beating them at being better engineers and all this stuff. And I looked it up, and it's like, no, that is not what happened. Like, this is just about as realistic as like Disney's Pocahontas when it comes to what happened. Like, there's technically, like, the guy who wrote it was a French guy. He was a prisoner of war, but he had nothing to do with any bridge building story or anything like that. There was a bridge that was built over the Mekong River, which was later part of it called the Kwai River because there were so many tourists coming to see it. And so the Thai people were like, yeah, it's over there. It wasn't. And this whole, like, Nicholson is based off of a real colonel. His name was Colonel Tusi, who was, his approach, his rebellion was so completely different than this movie. It was the opposite. Like, he would try to subtly sabotage the bridge. They would poorly mix their cement, or they would put ants in the wood. And he would do that because he wanted to rebel, but not in a way that would endanger his men. And so when he saw, and he lived, and when he saw this movie, he was very upset that people took this movie as seriously as they did. That when we say based on a true story, people just take it as like, oh, I'm sure they took a couple liberties. And so he was very frustrated, especially in the scene where, like, Saito says to Alec Guinness, you know, like, make your officers work or I'm going to shoot you all right now. I'm going to kill all of you. And he's like, Geneva Convention, by golly. And then they get kind of saved, you know, by a coincidence. But the thing is the man that this was based off of, he's like, I would never do that. I would never risk all the lives of all of my officers in order to make this kind of point. So anyway, so that was just really, so I was like, so nothing gets a pass, you know, the exoticized Thai women falling in love or giving googly eyes to the American and the Canadian. I was like, none of this gets a pass because it's not real, you know, because so all it falls under is just what the movie makers wanted. So. I
can agree. I definitely can agree with you about the women. I think, like I said, I thought that the William Holden part, Commander Shears, I think that is, to me, the weakest part of the movie. It's definitely the slowest part of the movie. I just think his character is less interesting. I've seen that sort of cynical captain kind of thing a lot, you know, just Catch-22 or, you know, just lots of different things. And so to me, that's not really that interesting. I think maybe it just comes down to, do you find this sort of battle of wills between these two people? Do you find that interesting? Do you find that compelling, or you know, or do you not, you know, or does it bother you? And so I can see where you're coming from, and I can see what you're saying about the true story aspects of it. And I do think that Lawrence of Arabia is a better movie just because Lawrence of Arabia is so unique and so different. And just like every scene of Lawrence of Arabia to me was just like, I did not think that was going to happen. I did not think they were going to do that. And then there's like this and this and this. And it did not feel, you know, 3 hours to me. And a lot of people think that's boring. I disagree. I did not think that was boring. And I do think that there are parts that it feels 3 hours. And so I do think that Lawrence of Arabia is a better film. But this resonated with me. I do think that these two characters are really interesting, Saito and Nicholson, and I think I guess for me, I was willing to sort of suspend disbelief that like this particular platoon of Japanese soldiers didn't have a very good engineer, you know, like, and Saito was having to kind of figure this out on the fly, and you know, there was a certain desperation in him, you know, that he knew he was on this unmeetable deadline. He was on this, and I think that's part of the reason why it wasn't working out, you know, all that well, is because it was this crazy deadline and they're rushing and everything. And, you know, he has to get these British, soldiers to work with him, but he's got this stick in the mud with Nicholson. And then I think that Nicholson's pride is interesting to me, that he's so strong and he's willing to go into the hot box for all this time and over this issue of his officers. But then as soon as he wins, in a way, it's almost like he's sort of done. And then he's able to you see him progressively sort of give up everything that he just sacrificed and fought for with this whole standoff at the beginning. So that's what I think is sort of interesting. And the pride of both of these men and how it's sort of plays into their choices and their decisions and everything. And so I can understand what you mean, but
I think you make a lot of valid points. This is why I love talking movies with you, because I appreciate you being so understanding, of what distracted me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that distracted is a good word for it, because, while I think there are definitely some obvious issues, and I would stand by that, you're really pointing out to me that this movie does have a lot of redeeming qualities. There is a reason that it's revered as a classic.
Well, and I understand, because I saw the movie Silence, and I thought that movie was horrible. Now, if somebody were going to have a discussion with me and say wow, it had some really good performances and had, and explain their view, I totally would agree with them, because it's a well-made movie. Or recently with The Glass Castle, I had the same experience. My friend Sean went, and it totally reminded him of his family and the situations that he grew up with. I saw it, and I thought it was so infuriating, but not in a good way. I felt like what the directors did was very manipulative and very offensive to me. And so it is interesting. Nobody's wrong, it's just a discussion of different ways of looking at things. So I don't have. Sometimes I think people get very personal, you're insulting me if you didn't like something I liked, and that's just ridiculous. That's nonsense. But yeah, I can totally see what you mean, because you saw it from sort of a broader, I think, perspective than I did.
Well, and I think too, we bring so many of our own personal experiences to things like this, like my husband bringing in his military experience, that changes his viewing. Me, knowing so many Japanese people and knowing the culture so well, I feel more defensive of the representation of the Japanese because of that experience. And also I have an issue with British people sometimes. There were some issues there, even in Japan. That was where I had my most exposure to people from England. And oftentimes my interactions with them were really frustrating because of the attitudes that they had about how superior they were.
See, I'm a total Anglophile. I love all things British. I had a whole party for the royal wedding. I am huge anything British.
Oh, that's so funny, right? Yeah. So we bring this, right? So it's going to change our comfort levels with different statements being made, Sure. I could totally see how that's, affected things. And I won't ramble on.
Yeah, but fair enough. Okay. So I'll just read a little bit what Roger thought. I think that this is an interesting point. He says, most war movies are either for or against their wars. The Bridge on the River Kwai is one of the few that focuses not on larger rights and wrongs, but on individuals. He says, like Robert Graves' World War I memoir, Goodbye to All That, it shows men grimly hanging on to military discipline and pride in their units as a way of clinging to sanity. By the end of Kwai, we are less interested in who wins than in how individual characters will behave. So there you go. So that's Roger, his view. I'll put a link to his review if you want to check it out. So he described it as, he says, He says, the last words in David Lean's The Bridge on the River Kwai are madness, madness, madness. Although the film's two most important characters are both mad, the hero more than the villain, we're not quite certain what is intended by that final dialogue. Part of the puzzle is caused by the film's shifting points of view. Mm-hmm. So I think that's interesting too.
I read a review online too where, I was reading all these Reddit forums where people were discussing whether or not they thought this movie was racist. And this one guy was like, I don't think it's racist as much as it is nationalist, like the guys are like, oh, go Britain. And I would kind of compare that to the scene in like Master and Commander. Did you see that movie?
I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen it.
Well, there is a moment where Russell Crowe says, this ship is England and they're at war and everything. And he's pretty much creating this moment where it's like the ship that they're on represents their country. And to me, that's nationalism in its best form. I love that moment so much in that movie. But the thing is like their opposer, the French Navy, feels equal to them. There's this immense amount of respect that these two captains have for each other. Fear and respect and frustration, but it felt more like they were more equally yoked, particularly in their ability to do what they were doing. And maybe that's what I feel is missing here, but I think it wasn't only that, but it's even just the way that it's phrased. And maybe I'm getting too much into semantics that way, but there were just so many lines of this movie where they would specifically put down Japanese capabilities. Especially just the line where they were like, let's teach these Japanese a thing or two about methods of Western efficiency. And I was just like, dude, like they were building bridges before, just like since the dawn of time, especially if you're going to talk engineering. Anyway, so the guy who was like, oh, it's more nationalist than racist. I'm like, it often amounts to the same thing. I think it's kind of like patriotism, like patriotism can bleed into xenophobia so quickly. And I think that at its purest, patriotism can be a really good thing, but you have to be careful about how far you go with some of those sentiments. I think nationalism is a very similar thing. I think nationalism can be okay. I think it's good to be proud of your country. It's good to want to prove, that your country has something special to offer. But I think the difference is just when you make it at the cost of, seeing another country as equal or even human. So.
Yeah, it's totally fair point. I could totally see how if you were looking at this from a macro perspective, then that's fair, completely fair. I was just looking at these two men, and so I was looking at it as more of a narrow perspective. And I think that's what Roger was too. And so that's just it's just a different way of looking at it, which is why we have these discussions and have this podcast. And this did get a lot of Oscars. Not that necessarily means it's great, but it got Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Alec Guinness. It had a nomination for Sasuke Hayakawa, which is kind of cool for that era, I guess, to have Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Music, the score. I love the score. I think is great in this. Film editing and cinematography, all won. So that's pretty interesting. And so, it's interesting. And a lot of times I appreciate the fact that you are willing to say that you don't like a classic film, because there's some people I think that feel like you almost have to like classic films, and that's just ridiculous nonsense. There's plenty of classic films that I don't care for, and that I can see why other people like Dr. Zhivago, another David Lean film. It's not a bad film, but I didn't really love it. I had issues with it. I didn't really like the characters. Anyway, we can go into that in another podcast, I guess. But there are every film fan has classic films that they don't like. Or otherwise, you're not really being honest, I don't think, if you like every classic film. So I think that's totally valid and totally fine. So if you consider you didn't like it, what would you give it, like 1 to 10? Where would you rate it?
I think I would be being silly if I was like, oh, it's a 0 or 2 or something, you know. It'd just be me trying to prove that I don't like it, right? But I would consider watching this movie again, especially with someone who enjoyed it, to kind of, you know, talk about it. And so for that, it deserves a few more points, right? Like, there are some movies that are so bad, you're like, I don't need to see this again. There's nothing to learn here, you know, like, I'm done. So I would give it a 4. To me, it's less than okay. Like, 5 is okay. It's less than okay, but I think it has potential. I think there's context to consider. I recognize this movie was made
1957.
When the war was still very fresh in people's minds. And I think that, you know, the cinematography was decent. And I think that if I watched it without being so distracted, I would probably like that cinematography more. And the acting, I think if I gave myself time to enjoy it, then I would probably like that as well. So I'm going to give it a 4.
Sounds good. That sounds very fair. So I think I would give it an 8. I think that I really like the journey of these two men, and I really like the performances of the two men. But I do think that it is overlong. And I think that I don't think that anything with the Commander Shears is as good or as compelling or interesting. And I recognize some of those weaknesses that you talk about, like with the women and other, you know, some of the other characterizations can be a little broad. But I don't know. Overall, I think it is a very compelling character study. I think it's very well acted. I think that it is very well made as far as the cinematography, the score, the other things. I enjoy watching it. I think it's a good movie, but it's not like my favorite movie ever made. But so I'd give it an 8. 8 out of 10. I think for me. So there you go. That's our Like a Bridge on the River Kwai. So we will let you know what we're going to talk about next. You want to make sure you follow us at Chicks on Flick on Twitter. I have a very exciting announcement that I was able to get Rachel's reviews on to iTunes. So I'm going to put a link in the description section here. Please go on there, subscribe to our iTunes, and if you could leave a positive review, I would love it. We would love it. Both of us would love it. That's very exciting. I finally figured it out. I've been, just sort of this podcasting thing, just sort of figuring it out as I go. And so I figured out iTunes yesterday, which was very exciting.
So cool.
Yeah, so check that out. And, we'll have some fun upcoming podcasts. I've been working with a friend of mine, Patrick. We are going to be talking about Blade Runner coming up, which will be really fun. I'm also going to be doing another one in the next couple of weeks on Big Trouble Little China, whatever.
Big
I don't
Trouble
know.
In Little China.
Little China, yeah. I've never seen it, so that one's going to be fun. With my friend AJ. So anyway, so lots of fun things going on and new experiences and everything. So this Sunday, the family movie night pick is Swan Princess. So tomorrow you want to check that out. So anyway, lots of fun stuff. And so where can people find you?
People can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/ctylervision. Or you can just look up Christine Tyler, and I'm pretty easy to find. I am also doing a monthly Bookstagram challenge, which is where you take pictures of books on Instagram with my friend Chris Atkins. And so you can find that, what is it? It's Instagram. My name is C. Tyler Books. And this month's theme is Harry Potter. And we are doing a Harry Potter themed prize box. And we got like time turners because we have 2 boxes. So we have, time turners in each. And I'm going to knit scarves for people's houses. It's just going to be so cool. So definitely check us out on Instagram. It's C. Tyler Books. And my friend Chris Atkins is Chris Atkins Writes. It's just all one word. So yeah,
okay, great.
We'd love people to join in on that.
Yeah, I'll have the links down in the description section. You want to check all that out for sure. So thanks so much for talking about this. I know it's hard sometimes if you have an unpopular opinion, and I really respect what you had to say. And so thanks for joining me and talking about Bridge on the River Kwai.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you letting me share it with you. So thank you.
No problem. And we, like I said, we'll talk and figure out what we're going to do next. And so thanks, and we will see you all later.
All right. Bye.